Part 4. Old Kingdom. Abusir and after. 2500 to 2200 BC. 11. Abusir and Saqqara. Borchardt at Abusir. On a fine day, standing on the breezy ridge of Memphis Desert. Cemeteries, the better part of Egypt's pyramids are in clear view, from Pharaoh's colossal pyramids on the plain of Dishur in the south to Giza's famous line of three dark triangles. Built for the most part in the 26th century BC, those mighty pyramids stand as bookends to a line of smaller ones that over the course of the next 300 years were set down between them, 11 royal monuments at least and maybe more, yet to be discovered, along with their attendant temples and an uncounted mass of accompanying tombs. Though these later pyramids were far smaller than their predecessors, their architecture less accurate, their masonry relatively rough and ill-assembled, there were nonetheless considerable monuments in their own right, so that, although their temples and their causeways were abandoned and smothered in deep sand within centuries of their construction, most of the pyramids were never lost to view. So in the first half of the 19th century, the better part of them were picked and prodded by the work gangs of European adventurers and architects, most of whom were interested in the royal burial chambers and the treasures that they might contain. But hardly anyone had touched the buried temples that had stood beside them. Large sand-choked monuments require archaeology on a heroic scale. For their excavation, long-term well-funded enterprises that, in the majority of cases, it was these temples' good fortune to host a succession of French archaeologists and the Egyptian Service d'Antiquité working in the Saqqara cemeteries throughout the best part of the last century, a project that continues to this day. The heroic age of pyramid excavation, however, which set the pace for all later work, was undertaken in the decades before the First World War by George Reisner at Giza and by the Berlin archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt, who excavated a cluster of pyramids and temples on the Saqqara Ridge some 7 miles south of the Giza Plateau. In Borchardt's time, the desert landscape in which those pyramids and temples had lain was different from that of today. Nowadays, you walk up to them past the farmhouses and villas of the village of Abusir from which these pyramids derive their modern name, past mud-plastered walls and shadowed groves of silvered palms, before stepping out onto the steep bright slopes of the desert beyond and, up above it all, the blunted tops of groups of sanded pyramids. In Borchardt's day, however, as in the distant past, those same pyramids had stood open to the Nile's Valley and its wide green fields, a lonely landscape far smaller in its scale than Giza's high plateau. And the desert had been fringed with a spiky line of camel grass that marked the edges of the water table and framed the crops below. After the scorching summer season in which the fields had cracked and nothing grew, after Sirius had risen with the Nile, the pyramids and temples of Abusir had stood close to the reflecting waters of the inundation, the flood covering the fields on both sides of the river. Then, as it receded, so Borchardt's photographs show, it had left oxbow lakes and lines of water shining in the mud, these, perhaps, the distant echoes of ancient harbors and canals. After the 1960s, however, when the high dam was built and filled and the annual flood had stopped, and tractors, pumps and irrigation schemes were introduced, the fields grew larger in their sizes and the deserts by the pyramids were inundated by a concrete flood of cemeteries and villas. The ancient ways of life beside the pyramids began to disappear, along with the landscapes in which those monuments had long been the commanding element. So the records of those early excavators, Reisner at Giza and Borchardt at Abusir, who were amongst the first to use photography to document their excavations, show the pyramids much as they had appeared during the previous 4,000 years, with billows of wind-blown sand covering their temples and their causeways, and the pyramids' peaks framing the edges of a broad green plain. Unlike Reisner's Giza excavations, which apart from the temples of Menkaure had concentrated on courtiers' tombs, Borchardt largely worked upon the regal monuments at Abusir, clearing several of its 8 known pyramids and temples, including the largest monuments at the site, those of Sir, Musir, and Neferukar. And there it was, amongst the major monuments, that he made the most remarkable of his finds, for though those pyramids were smaller and less well built than those at Giza, the tumbled temples which lay beside those pyramids, so Borchardt discovered, had been more complex in their architecture and more variegated in their use of desert stone. And the beauty of those temples' architectural elements, the columns, the door jambs and the lintels that lay beside their ruined pyramids like necklaces half buried in the sand, showed that the craftsmen and masons of the kings of Abusir had held the same skills and sensibilities as those of the Giza kings before them. Borchardt uncovered wonders in those ruined temples. Granite columns carved in the perfected geometric forms of tight-bound bundles of papyrus stalks. Smooth round columns emblazoned with the names of kings with capitals like palm fronds so beautifully carved that, even in museums, their granite seems to wave in the Egyptian evening breeze. Even the huge monolithic elements of the temple's rooms and doorways, ramps and staircases that had been cut from massive blocks of stone had a light, fresh elegance. As his photographs still show, Borchardt's previous career as a Königliche Regierungsbauführer, as a master builder of the King of Prussia, came to the fore as his work gang struggled to manipulate and re-erect by hand and rope those dangerously tumbled ruins. Published in a series of splendid folios and essays that extended from 1905 into the following decades, Borchardt's descriptions of the major monuments of Abusir is architectural reconstructions of how they had appeared just after they were built, especially his distinctive graphics showing sharp blank buildings drawn in black and white and seen either from a bird's eye view or with a vanishing point close to the ground, have influenced all subsequent visions of Egyptian pyramids. A history in pyramids. The kings whose pyramids stand at Abusir were the successors of the monarchs for whom the Giza pyramids were built, like those of Giza. The royal pyramids at Abusir are also clustered in a group with some set one behind the other. And as at Giza, after some 60 years of pyramid building at Abusir, the king's construction teams moved southwards once again, down along the desert's ridge back into the ancient cemeteries of Saqqara, where they made more tombs and pyramids over the next 2 centuries, down to the Old Kingdom's ending. Little is known of the beginnings of the long-lived royal house for whom those pyramids had been constructed. In all probability, the Pharaoh Sneferu, in whose reign the first 2 of the 4 colossal pyramids were built, was of the household of a little-known predecessor called Huni, who is listed as the last ruler of Manetho's 3rd dynasty of kings but whose funerary enclosure is yet undiscovered and whose memorials are small and brief. Certainly, from Sneferu down to Menkaure, the last of the Giza kings, the surviving evidence shows the throne passing down through generations of that same household and that the smaller pyramids and tombs built beside those 3 colossi in those same times were made for members of that royal household and for some leading members of the households of the courtiers. In the decade following the death of Menkaure around 2515 BC, no pyramids were built at all, just 2 oblong monuments, long low bench-like rectangles of stone, architectural variants on the archaic so-called Nasaba tomb, marking 2 colossal granite-lined burial vaults cut deep into the underlying desert. These show, at least, that pharaohs craftsmen built pyramids by choice rather than blindly following tradition. One of these unusual monuments had been built for Shepseskh, Menkaure's successor to the throne, and was set in the desert of Saqqara, some 10 miles to the south of Menkaure's pyramid. The other smaller, more elaborate monument was built within a Giza quarry. Its inscriptions tell that it had been made for a woman named Kent-Kaz, who appears to have borne the epithet mother of 2 kings but who, to the consternation of chronologers, appears to have been shown upon a Granite doorway of that monument wearing a false beard, which is part of the regalia worn by the images of kings. Traditional histories of the decade that followed the building of the Giza pyramids have been greatly enlivened by the prophecies of the elderly magician who appears alongside Hardiyadef in the tales of the Papyrus Weskar, the last of whose stories relate how Jedi the soothsayer foretold that a certain Regidet, the wife of a provincial priest, would give birth to triplets, each one of whom would be a king of Egypt, as two of her triplets' names resemble those of two kings of Abusir. The Lady Regidet was identified as Queen Kentkaz, the bearded matriarch, and described as acting as co-regent with two of those named kings. The monuments, however, also show that a pyramid was built at Abusir for a woman of the court whose name was also Kentkaz. And a generation later, yet another tomb was made for a further, or perhaps the same, queen called Kentkaz. As ever, there is entirely insufficient data to accurately reconstruct a family tree. Yet the recurrence of that name at Giza and Abusir, along with other names like Hetep and Meres-ankh, who are similarly designated in traditional translations as mothers, daughters and the consorts of the kings of those same times, suggests a strong continuity between the kings at Abusir and Giza, that there had been a carefully cultivated monarchic succession within a single household. As for the prophecies of the Papyrus Weskar, best to resist the temptation to set selected snippets from its magic tales to dance upon the points of pyramids. Amongst the hosts of tombs that surround the pyramid of King Neki-ankh, Saqqara, a monarch who reigned a century after the kings of Abusir, stands one built for a certain Kentkaz who is often designated as Queen Kentkaz III, and another for a queen named Iput. And once again, translations of the texts that accompany these royal women variously designate them as the consorts, mothers and the children of the kings. That Iput's tomb was originally built as a mastaba and then converted into a pyramid during the lengthy later reign of Papyri certainly suggests that she had been a long-lived presence in the royal household, though the theory that the king himself demanded a change and the design of his mother's tomb to improve her status is a product, surely, of the consumer age. Remarkably enough, Iput's burial was found relatively undisturbed. A middle-aged woman with long brown hair, she had been laid within a cedar coffin set inside a stone sarcophagus and was surrounded by a scattering of broken jewelry and other fragments of the paraphernalia of courtly burial. Like so much of what remains from ancient Egypt, they are the intimate relics of an entirely enigmatic figure. By Iput's day, that royal house had attained a remarkable and apparently benign longevity. At its ending, two kings, Pepi I and Pepi II, appear to have reigned over the best part of a century and a half, a period well attested in good hard stone by the continuous elaboration of those kings' funerary complexes and by the continuing accretion of smaller pyramids and tombs and temples at the royal burial grounds and in such profusion that they are in the processes of excavation to this day. Suddenly, though, at around 2200 BC the building stops. And in the following generation, for lack of monuments and inscriptions, the long-lived household which had ruled throughout the period that Baron Bunsen christened the Old Kingdom quite disappears from view. Dissolution those same times were made for members of that royal household and for some leading members of the households of the courtiers. In the decade following the death of Menkore around 2515 BC, no pyramids were built at all, just two oblong monuments, long low bench-like rectangles of stone, architectural variants on the archaic so-called mastaba tomb, marking two colossal granite-lined burial vaults cut deep into the underlying desert. These show, at least, that pharaohs craftsmen built pyramids by choice rather than blindly following tradition. One of these unusual monuments had been built for Shepseskh, Menkore's successor to the throne, and was set in the desert of Saqqara, some 10 miles to the south of Menkore's pyramid. The other smaller, more elaborate monument was built within a Giza quarry. Its Inscriptions tell that it had been made for a woman named Canquest, who appears to have borne the epithet mother of two kings but who, too, the consternation of chronologers, appears to have been shown upon a granite doorway of that monument wearing a false beard, which is part of the regalia worn by the images of kings. Traditional histories of the decade that followed the building of the Giza pyramids have been greatly enlivened by the prophecies of the elderly magician who appears alongside Hardiedev in the tales of the Papyrus Saqqara, the last of whose stories relate how Jedi the soothsayer foretold that a certain Regidet, the wife of a provincial priest, would give birth to triplets, each one of whom would be a king of Egypt, as two of her triplets' names resemble those of two kings of Abusir. The Lady Regidet was identified as Queen Canquest, the bearded matriarch, and described as acting as co-regent with two of those named kings. The monuments, however, also show that a pyramid was built at Abusir for a woman of the court whose name was also Canquest, and a generation later, yet another tomb was made for a further, or perhaps the same, queen called Canquest. As ever, there is entirely insufficient data to accurately reconstruct a family tree. Yet the recurrence of that name at Giza and Abusir, along with other names like Hetep and Neki-ankh, who are similarly designated in traditional translations as mothers, daughters and the consorts of the kings of those same times, suggests a strong continuity between the kings at Abusir and Giza, that there had been a carefully cultivated monarchic succession within a single household. As for the prophecies of the Papyrus Saqqara, best to resist the temptation to set selected snippets from its magic tales to dance upon the points of pyramids. Amongst the hosts of tombs that surround the pyramid of King Neki-ankh, Saqqara, a monarch who reigned a century after the kings of Abusir, stands one built for a certain Canquest who is often designated as Queen Canquest III, and another for a queen named Iput. And once again, translations of the texts that accompany these royal women variously designate them as the consorts, mothers and the children of the kings. That Iput's tomb was originally built as a mastaba and then converted into a pyramid during the lengthy later reign of Papyri certainly suggests that she had been a long-lived presence in the royal household, though the theory that the king himself demanded a change in the design of his mother's tomb to improve her status is a product, surely, of the consumer age. Remarkably enough, Iput's burial was found relatively undisturbed. A middle-aged woman with long brown hair, she had been laid within a cedar coffin set inside a stone sarcophagus and was surrounded by a scattering of broken jewelry and other fragments of the paraphernalia of courtly burial. Like so much of what remains from ancient Egypt, they are the intimate relics of an entirely enigmatic figure. By Iput's day, that royal house had attained a remarkable and apparently benign longevity. At its ending, two kings, Pepi I and Pepi II, appear to have reigned over the best part of a century and a half, a period well attested in good hard stone by the continuous elaboration of those kings' funerary complexes and by the continuing accretion of smaller pyramids and tombs and temples at the royal burial grounds and in such profusion that they are in the processes of excavation to this day. Suddenly, though, at around 2200 BC the building stops. And in the following generation, for lack of monuments and inscriptions, the long-lived household which had ruled throughout the period that Baron Bunsen christened the Old Kingdom quite disappears from view. Dissolution. Unlike Reisner's Giza excavations, Borchardt recovered huge quantities of limestone fragments at Abusir, scraps of the walls of the largely vanished royal temples and the detritus of an industry that had mined the monuments of Pharaoh for stone and for the raw material of builders' mortar. Hellenistic architects and engineers had introduced lime mortar into Egypt in the last centuries BC, and it quickly replaced the softer and less tenacious gypsum plaster used in pharaonic times. At Abusir, the kilns that had rendered the temple stone into slate lime appear to have operated over several centuries, for Borchardt found graffiti on some of the temple's fragments that had been made between the 4th and 6th centuries AD when, judging from the angle that they were drawn, the temple's walls had still been vertical and, therefore, in their original positions. Hungry lime kilns devoured a great part of ancient and classical architecture and sculpture, a slow-burning tragedy that was yet under way in the 15th century AD when the letters of the traveling merchant Saraiko d'Ancona sorrowfully described classical marbles being fed to the kilns in various locations throughout the eastern Mediterranean. These same processes were also responsible for the destruction of much of ancient Memphis and its cemeteries, long before the arrival of the European collectors, a great deal of its monuments, decorated limestone blocks having been taken down and burned. The especial attraction that Abusir and the other Memphite cemeteries held for lime makers was the fine quality of the blocks of imported limestone with which many of the tomb chapels and temples had been faced. A soft, white, even stone, it had provided a perfect medium for pharaonic craftsmen, who had used it for everything from facing the great pyramids to the doorjambs of modest tomb chapels. Quarried, for the most part, in small-sized blocks from the cliffs of Tura across the river from Saqqara, the stone was easily rendered into slaked lime by splitting the blocks with chisels and firing the resulting fragments to red heat in a simple updraft kiln. At Saqqara, some of the main actors in this terrific drama were the monks of the desert monastery of Appa Jeremiah, a considerable settlement of mud brick buildings which had been built in the sand of the Saqqara cemeteries and was surrounded by several splendid churches, whose fallen Roman columns cluster still, like logjams in the wind-blown sand. Founded in the 5th century by the saint himself on the footings of some pharaonic tomb chapels, his monks ranged far and wide throughout the Memphite cemeteries during the 3 centuries of the monastery's existence, demolishing monuments, making slaked limes, and taking many fine white limestone blocks for use within their monastery. So a bishop's sarcophagus was cut from a great limestone lintel engraved with superb late-period hieroglyphs, whilst another reused lintel elegantly carved with King Sutter's name was transformed into a doorsill at the monastery's olive presses, the latter, presumably, having been brought from one of the king's monuments at Abusir, where monks had converted a temple storeroom into a little chapel. Other similarly procured limestone blocks were swiftly recarved with the passionate tendrils and acanthus of Byzantine capitals or transformed into stumpy columns decorated with the zigzag geometries and spirals, typical of local Christian stone work of the times. In those days, many monastic communities throughout Egypt were attacking and reusing the materials of ancient monuments with a similar enthusiasm, not a little venom and even, perhaps, some fear, for many of the early fathers believed that spiteful spirits inhabited the ancient tombs and temples. At Abusir, Borchardt quickly discovered that lime burners and quarrymen had demolished entire temples along with their connecting causeways. Yet as his excavators cleared the drifted sand from their foundations, they gathered up some 10,000 fragments of decorated wall reliefs along with odd blocks that still held disembodied portions of most beautiful relief, parts of large scenes that had extended all across the temple's high white walls, strewn out of context by the lime burners. Many of these fragments were of the finest quality and of nicely portable size, just the sort of antiquity that dealers and collectors are eager to obtain. Broken images of kings and gods and their earthly retinues. Dislocated fragments of hunting, sailing and offering scenes, a shattered picture of the pharaonic universe, scraps of an ancient description d'Egypte of which, Borchardt estimated, just 1% of the original remained. Restoration. There was but limited evidence of the original locations of most of the fragments of relief that Borchardt found at Abusir, which walls, which courts, which temple, even, they had once decorated. Such was the conservatism of the relief's designers, however, that most pieces could be identified and placed as elements in one of a small group of scenes butchering and hunting, fishing and boating, festival, offering and the like, which had been engraved and painted on the walls of other temples and tomb chapels for a century and more before the times of the kings of Abusir, and had continued to be employed in the decorations of monuments throughout the following millennia. So as Borchardt's team started to put those enormous broken jigsaws back together, they were able to compare the Abusir fragments with a huge corpus of similar images and scenes, many of which were still complete. In this way, the original positions of many fragments from those vanished walls were identified and entire scenes were reconstructed. It was a major step forward in modern understanding of pharaonic culture, not the least because some of those scenes had served as exemplars of their genre. Over the following millennia, a few broken blocks from a wall of the Pyramid Temple of Ser, for example, yet bear the lines of copying grids drawn some 18 centuries later by the craftsmen of another pharaonic court, laid out in elegant folios, Borchardt's masterly drawings, reconstructing several of the reliefs from the Temple of King Ser, of which more remain than those from other temples, show that the master craftsmen of the court of Abusir had designed some of the most elaborate examples of pharaonic wall decoration ever made, their compositions extending, on occasion, for 50 feet and more. At the same time, the fragments also showed that the execution of those great scenes had been every bit as fine as the work of earlier generations. There too, amongst the many splendid images of courts and kings, were many tiny details, those look at that moments, that are popular today as illustrations of ancient Egyptian art. A monkey plays with a little boy, a mongoose climbs the bending stem of a papyrus plant, a wounded hyena attempts to paw a hunter's arrow from his eye. Lively details that have the appearance of being the products of direct observation from life, yet would also be repeated time and time again with similar vivacity throughout the following millennia alongside the standard repertoire of gods, courtiers and kings. Given this sparkling combination of formal magnificence and their lively account of some of the minutiae of daily life, it is tempting to claim the Abusir reliefs as the prototypes of many of the standard scenes of later pharaonic wall decoration, especially as the lime kilns have consumed most earlier reliefs, leaving but tiny fragments. Yet there is no firm indication of how or when many of those standard scenes had been invented, nor even if they had been created for the royal monuments or the courtiers' tomb chapels. Certainly, some of the typical themes of pharaonic temple and tomb chapel decoration that appear at Abusir, such as hunting, fishing and bird snaring, dancing, boating and offering, already had extensive pedigrees. Scenes of hippopotamus hunting, for example, an activity in which Egyptian monarchs from Ser to Roman pharaohs are pictured taking part, had been drawn on prehistoric pots and scratched into some of the slate cosmetic grinding palettes of those far-off days. In Ser's temple, however, the scene had been set within the context of court ritual. Other Abusir reliefs, alternatively, show exclusive royal activities and images and had appeared in various forms since the beginning of that office, scenes such as those showing the king marking out the foundations of great buildings, the so-called Heb festival and the iconic image of Pharaoh smiting captives with a mace. Other scenes, however, some lavish and complex compositions of court ceremonial and some of those that show Ser in the company of court deities, have scant pedigree. With or without precedent, many of these royal images would be reproduced throughout the following millennia and became the subject matter of the colossal reliefs on the walls of the greatest Egyptian temples. What, then, had been the point and purposes in placing these elaborate visual presentations within the temples of Abusir? Their continued repetition, temple after temple, age after age, underlines the fact that they are not the biographical memorials of individual rulers, Whatever fragments of personal information the Abusir reliefs might once have held about an individual monarch's love of hunting, boating, and the rest was subsumed into scenes that display the proper order of the offices of state, for whatever other purposes they served, all those great grand compositions of parades, of ritual and the royal hunt had laid out the structure and high etiquette of the pharaonic court as it undertook those various activities, in order that is reduced to its essentials in the scenes of indoor ceremonial and temple rite. In similar fashion, the short texts that had accompanied those visual pageants provide more lessons, more instruction, in the way that things should be done, in comparison with the rare earlier examples of those same scenes that have survived. Their elaboration in the temples of Abusir suggests a genuine historical development, for here the subject matter of the earlier reliefs was transformed into a series of complex diagrams, displaying the precedence of the king, his household and his court. Diagrams in which the state's officials, some of whom are identified by name, are shown in serried ranks performing their various appointed tasks. At Abusir, therefore, these scenes appear as part of the continuing processes of state definition, a formalization of the offices of a court, which appears to have increased in complexity and size since the times of the construction of the Giza pyramids, when governance appears to have been based on face-to-face contact within a group of people from related households. At Abusir, however, as row upon row of courtiers and servants, sailors and farmers had bowed to praise the king, the scenes had underlined a trend in the contemporary tomb chapels in which the titles of the courtiers became more numerous and complex in the generations after Sir than they had ever been before. In similar fashion, some of the later royal reliefs in the Saqqara temples show that the scenes in the Abusir temples were increasingly formalized. In the Pyramid Temple of Pepi II, for example, the previously lively scene of a royal hunt has been transformed into one showing the ritual slaughter of a desert antelope. Such elaborations, however, did not stop later generations of craftsmen returning such activities to their original settings. Following their appearance in the royal temples, even such apparently simple tomb chapel scenes as a noble hunting in the desert or fishing in the Nile's marshes would have held meaning and resonance beyond the images of daily life that they so faithfully portray. With care and acumen, Borchardt was able to place many of these reconstructed reliefs back in the architecture of the broken temples. Their entrances, he found, had often been decorated with scenes in which the kings were embraced and sometimes suckled by the gods, which speaks of those buildings serving as the climax of a route to the temple's ritual heart, where sustaining offerings were regularly made to the royal spirit. Beyond those doorways, the temple's corridors and rooms had contained the huge reliefs with their vivid and exquisite detail, and at their centers, close to the offering tables, were smaller, simpler scenes of ritual and offering, images of the activities that were undertaken in that same area within the temple on each and every day. There is no evidence of the intended audience of these reliefs. Large parts of them were set so high upon the walls that in the darkness of those enclosed spaces they would have required a lamp and ladder for their viewing. This implies that they were not intended to advertise the messages of power and propaganda that have been traditionally attributed to them, even if those areas within the temples had been open to those literate in courtly texts and imagery. Judging by their quality and subject matter, the point and purposes of the reliefs was the continuing definition, the dialogues involved in the creation of such complex scenes, the further realization of the aura and activities of the pharaonic court. 12. Meat, bread, and stone. An economy of offering. Heliopolis. Not far from the pyramids of Abusir but on the east bank of the river lies a fabled district that bears the ancient classical name of Heliopolis, the city of the sun. Where once had stood the obelisks that are now in London and New York, trapped today beneath a mesh of tarmac roads. In Cairo's northern suburbs, Heliopolis has become a largely literary location, its monuments having perished to the point where a single standing obelisk, some reconstructed columns and a few stone blocks now mark the site. Even the enormous mud brick enclosure walls mapped by Napoleon's savants have largely disappeared, along with an avenue of sphinxes which had so impressed their early European visitors. Like Memphis on the river's other bank, 2 centuries of desultory and often rapacious digging uncovered a millennial diversity of relics at Heliopolis. Still today, foundations dug for new villas and apartments in the area bring to light the tombs of priests, the mud brick walls of ancient houses, or a confusing scattering of smaller relics, everything from prehistoric pottery to that of the times of the last native pharaohs. Not a trace, however, has been found of Heliopolis' most famous monument in the font of its millennial celebrity. For many ancient texts describe ancient Ayunu, as it was known, as holding one of the greatest of pharaonic shrines. And at its heart, they tell, had stood a mysterious monument that marked the center of the cult of the sun god Re. Known as the Benben, it is pictured in a hieroglyph as a somewhat stumpy obelisk, an obelisk said to have been capped with sheets of gold. It is as difficult today to uncover the origins of the god Re as it is to trace the architecture of his shrine at Heliopolis. Re's role in the pharaonic kingdom was enormously elaborated in later periods, and traditional historians tend to cast that later grand complexity back into the ages of the gods' beginnings. Real evidence, however, is extremely thin. Like several pharaonic deities, some of the hieroglyphs that are associated with Re had prehistoric origins. The god first makes his appearance in human form, however, as a hawk-headed man in the company of several other gods, a member of a household of deities centered on the living king. In the times of the 4 great pyramids, that common kinship, Re and Pharaoh, god and man, was described by the royal epithet which, following Champollion's translators, is usually rendered as the son of Re. In the following centuries, in the decorations of the pyramid temples both at Abusir and Saqqara, the circle of the sun, the simple hieroglyph that denominates Re's name, was joined to the wings of a hawk, that high-flying bird whose graphic image was a royal emblem older than the sun disk. So the image of Re the sun god, the father of the king, was joined to the image of Horakti, Horus of the horizon, and the great state deity Re-Horakti was born. As a sun god, Re would be described by later scribes as a life creator and sustainer, whilst the daily progress of his disk through the sky made him a measure of time. So as sons of Re, the living kings were similarly identified as the creators and sustainers of the state and, like the sun god, they too ordered human time, without Re and his earthly son. Therefore, the order and the very time in which the royal court existed would cease, and thus the valley of the lower Nile would no longer sustain the order of pharaonic culture. It is not surprising, therefore, that one of the titles of senior Old Kingdom courtiers was that of the chief official of Re's shrine at Heliopolis, often translated as chief of seers. The epithet has been literally interpreted as evidence that this great enclosure with the mysterious Benben at its center had been the point from which the court observed the solstices, and thus was the place from where the kingdom's yearly calendar was regulated. A great mud mound, which later scribes described as the primeval mound, the first landfall to emerge as the waters of creation had receded, was said to stand at the center of Heliopolis and has been tentatively identified as the archaic platform from which those solar observations were first made. All of those descriptions, however, are derived from the texts of later ages. Nor, it would appear, were great stone monuments erected at Heliopolis in the times of the early pyramid builders. A few broken fragments of a modest limestone shrine made in the time of Djoser, the pharaoh for whom the first pyramid had been built, were found in the rubbish of a refuse pit at Heliopolis, which shows that royal monuments may have been set up there at that time, though not necessarily for the sun god Re, who makes his first known appearance in human form only in the following century. Some priestly tombs, however, the fragments of another shrine in the tip of a modest limestone obelisk, the oldest known example of that archetypal pharaonic monument, show further evidence of state-building works at Heliopolis in Old Kingdom times. And though none of those fragments have the name of Re upon them, the broken obelisks hint strongly of his presence at the site, for like the Benben, obelisks were associated with that solar deity. The mirage of Old Kingdom Heliopolis, city of the sun god, has recently been enlivened with the observation that some of the pyramids on the west bank of the Nile may have been orientated to the shrine of Re at Heliopolis. The famous line of pyramids at Giza, for example, is said to have been aligned to the mysterious Benben that stood some 15 miles away across the marshy valley. The pyramids of Abusir, alternatively, and all the pyramids of Saqqara were screened from a direct line of sight with Heliopolis by the high cliffs of the Gable Mugatam that stands behind Old Cairo, a few hundred yards to the north of the Abusir pyramids, however, exactly at the point at which the direct line of sight to Heliopolis had disappeared behind the cliffs of the Mugatam. Texts tell that several of the Abusir kings had temples erected in their name, each one with a stumpy obelisk set at their center. These were the so-called Sun Temples, whose names are listed as the Field of Re, the birthplace of Re, the horizon of Re, the offering table of Re, and the place of the heart of Re. Just 2 of these Sun Temples have been located and excavated. Both were originally built of mud brick and subsequently elaborated and rebuilt in more permanent materials. The focus of their architecture resembled the hieroglyph that represents the Benben of Heliopolis, and, in comparison with the nearby pyramids, their stocky obelisks are of relatively modest size. In their final phases, however, after considerable elaboration and enlargement, those structures had been enlarged and elaborated and stood within architectural complexes similar to those of the nearby pyramids, each one with 2 attendant temples, the upper joined by a lengthy causeway to a lower temple. At least one of the upper temples had a splendid series of reliefs engraved upon its limestone walls which, so the remaining fragments show, had been of equal size and quality to those within the nearby royal temples at Abusir. Great offering tables had stood at the center of the courtyards of the upper temples in front of their Heliopolitan-style obelisks and were open to the sky. Standing by those altars, looking out across the yellow desert over the fields, the shining river and the bright green marsh, the temple priests could see the Benben at Heliopolis, its gold cap glinting in the sun. As to the purposes of those most innovative temples, rare fragmentary papyri found at Abusir show that they had played a vital role within the system of tithing, offering and distribution in those times, the processes which defined and sustained that state, its gods, its priestly households, and the generations of its kings and courtiers. The Abusir Papyri. Few papyri have survived from Old Kingdom times. Made from the sticky pithy strips of the stalks of papyrus, a flowering sedge that grew in profusion along the Nile's marshlands, papyri were stored in rolls and, though tougher than paper when they were new, their sheets are now extremely brittle and easily fragmented. So precious little remains of the considerable accounting systems that surely had accompanied the construction of the royal pyramids, let alone the written communications between the various support networks whose offices had run throughout the state. Remarkably, however, the tattered fragments of 3 different temple archives have been found in the sands of Abusir. The first of these was discovered in illicit excavations during the decade before Borchardt's arrival and may well have encouraged his interest in the site. Broken, divided and sold piecemeal to museums in Cairo, London, Berlin, and Paris, its contents were resurrected in the course of a lifetime's research by the French Egyptologist Paul Pozener-Krieger. The other two archives were recovered by Czech archaeologists who in the 1970s followed Borchardt in the excavation of Abusir and are still working at the site. These archives were found in the pyramid temples of two kings, Neferkar and Rainfurth, and that of a queen Kentkaz the Better. Part of them described some of the activities that took place within those temples long after the times of those for whom these monuments were made. Between them, they allow glimpses of the daily routines, the pulse, of the pharaonic state in the times of the Abusir kings, and yet beyond, a span from around 2500 BC of well over a century. The archive's contents fall into four main categories. First, they hold inventories of the temples and their various furnishings, and document their wear and tear. Secondly, they contain the rosters and the list of names of people involved in the ceremonies and other activities that took place within those temples. Thirdly, they record some of the produce and materials that were sent between the pyramid temples, the sun temples, and the storerooms of the royal household. And lastly, they record a number of royal decrees regulating those temples' activities, as one would expect from a culture that had organized huge labor forces and erected colossal and astonishingly precise pyramids over considerable periods of time. These records are carefully laid out and highly detailed, set in vertical columns and with 2, 3 and even 4 subheadings. The inventories resemble the tabulation of the near-contemporary Palermo stone. A single knife, for example, listed under a subcategory of materials as being made of flint, is described in another column as being the only one of its kind, and further, in another column detailing its condition, it is described as being chipped and its handle as having been repaired. 2 other flint knives, alternatively, are described as chipped from having been dropped, whilst the bowl identified in the subcategory of materials as being of Egyptian alabaster is further categorized as white, and its condition, in the appropriate column, as having had repairs to its rim, sides and base, as well as showing that those pieces of temple equipment, examples of which are exhibited today as ancient treasures, were similarly prized in ancient times. These objects' well-worn condition underlines the fact that those inventories were compiled decades after the temples which had housed them had first come into use. In similar fashion, another equally detailed inventory of the architecture of one of those temples describes a mud brick doorway as being damaged, whilst an accounting of deliveries of wood and mud brick to that same temple apparently records the quantities of the materials required for a doorway's restoration. As their archaeology confirms, these temples were well used and for considerable periods of time. The rites and ceremonies that the papyri list as having taken place within them, describing in some detail what their 300-odd personnel had undertaken on a daily, monthly and yearly basis. 2 different types of personnel were engaged in these activities. 1 was a permanent staff of priests, scribes and servants, the other, a group of 10 overseers. Remarkably, the latter group had functioned in a rotating system resembling the routines of the present-day guards of the remains of those same temples. In the times of the Abusir kings, the papyri record that the temple's permanent staff had undertaken rites in which the numerous statues in the temple's open courts, some of which are listed as wearing golden jewelry and other precious accoutrements, were censed and purified. The rotating staff, alternatively, had performed the intricate rituals in which the statues of the king that were enshrined in the dark rooms behind the temple's offering tables were brought into the light at sunrise, and then purified and dressed and presented with offerings before they were shut up again and sealed into their shrines at sunset. Thus the statues of the reigning king and those of his predecessors had joined the living world each day in royal dignity. Sun temples and slaughterhouses. The sections of the Abusir Papyri which have attracted the most attention are those that deal in daily life within the temples, listing the delivery of supplies of cloth and building materials and, most particularly, the provisions which were distributed to the temple staff and the households of their communities, along with those of numerous other priests and officials and, indeed, the household of the royal residents. Those ancient records further show that in the times of the Abusir kings, the sun temples had been centers for the processing and distribution of provisions gathered from across the regions of the lower Nile. It also appears that the sun temple staff had processed some of those supplies and operated breweries and bakeries, for some of the surviving papyri describe how cooked food was sent to the nearby pyramid temples on a daily basis. In partial confirmation, archaeology has shown that the two sun temples that have been excavated had held considerable numbers of magazines and storerooms, and also that they had undergone considerable enlargements and reigns later than those in which they had been built. The sun temples, therefore, had been major and enlarging elements in the system of supply of food and provisions too. The core offices of state. One of the papyri also contains an edict stipulating the amount of provisions that were to be sent from the Abusir temples to the offering cults of some of the courtiers' tomb chapels, offerings that would have supported the priestly communities who were serving the cults within. The growing numbers of such chapels in the Giza and Saqqara cemeteries, and life, as their inscriptions tell, the court officials for whom those tomb chapels were made had worked within the state machine, producing the materials that it required and controlling its storage and processing facilities. Many of their tomb chapels, indeed, contain reliefs that show them overseeing such activities. This, then, had been a highly structured system of supply that had operated within the court and had served both the living and the dead, though sharing the same layout as the royal pyramid complexes, with two temples, an upper and a lower joined by a causeway. The sun temples were smaller constructions. However, the enclosures of both their lower temples and their causeways were far larger in size than their equivalents at the royal pyramids, as were the open courts within their upper temples that held a benben at their center. The accounts in the papyri suggest that these modifications represent practical arrangements for herding, slaughtering and butchering the large quantities of cattle which, the records show, had passed through those facilities. Both known sun temples, indeed, still hold some of the amenities required for work on such a scale, the remains of elaborate drainage systems and rows of elegant and substantial alabaster basins had, though they stand bone white today within the yellow desert, would once have held the gore of slaughter. Hardly anything remains of the standing architecture of those two excavated temples. Borchardt and his successors performed remarkable feats of archaeological detection simply to determine their original forms. In the 1970s, however, Miroslav Werner excavated another smaller, contemporary abattoir that had been built beside the Pyramid of Rainforth, which he had also excavated, anciently named the House of the Knife. It had been a robust, large, rectangular mud brick building, containing a slaughtering chamber measuring some 30 by 20 feet with 3 tethering stones set into its floor and a chopping block raised at its center. This room had been open to the sky. Some of the 15 smaller enclosed chambers in the building had been used for smaller scale meat preparation. Others, as their red burnt brick suggested, had served as kitchens. One small room had held a staircase that must have led up to the roof where, so tomb chapel representations of such slaughterhouses suggest, strips and joints of meat may have been strung up in the sun to dry. Traces of both blood and cooking fires yet remained within the ruin of this slaughterhouse, as did the marks of its washing out with water on its whitewashed walls. A papyrus fragment from one of the temple archives tells that it had handled 13 beasts a day. At one of the nearby sun temples, whose upper courtyard was more than 10 times larger than the House of the Knife, a central offering table yet consists of 5 huge alabaster blocks, all of them precisely cut and beautifully matched in the translucent veining of their stones and set together in a sophisticated geometry. The circular hieroglyph of the sun's disk stands at its center and is represented by a perfect cylinder of honeyed alabaster some 3 feet high, which is framed by a quadrangle of 4 colossal so-called hetep hieroglyphs of similarly fine materials and dimensions, 4 images of a loaf upon a mat, each one some 12 feet long. This massive and near abstract image is presently unique, sun disk surrounded by 4 massive hieroglyphs, signifying offering or satisfaction standing quite alone, upon an ancient limestone pavement. Meat offerings were important elements of the funeral rites of both kings and courtiers, and also, so the papyrus archives tell, of the daily rituals of offering that were conducted in the royal name within the temples. Thus scenes of slaughtering and butchery are common in tomb chapels and temples of all periods of pharaonic history. Slaughtering, indeed, appears to have been considered an activity similar to hunting, and both were bound in ritual, though the kings themselves are seldom shown as temple slaughterers. In the Abusir reliefs, monarchs are pictured killing desert animals trapped inside man-made enclosures with a bow and arrow, whilst a later rare relief in a Saqqara temple shows the king slitting the throat of a wild desert antelope in an act of sacrifice. Such vast facilities for slaughter, surviving data suggest that the 2 known sun temples alone could have supplied more than 200 carcasses a day to the various offices of state, raises important questions of supply, like the activities of quarrying and mining and the erection of stone monuments. The rearing of large herds of cattle required more resources than those available in simple farming settlements, where village households usually reared pigs and fowl. Effectively, therefore, livestock breeding on such a scale was an enterprise conducted under the auspices of the state. So it is hardly surprising that, in common with many other ancient societies, the mass slaughtering of cattle appears to have taken place within a context of the courtly rituals that define such ancient states. It would appear, therefore, that tokens of the enormous quantities of animals that, the records show, were slaughtered and butchered in the courtyards of the sun temples, traditionally the animal's forelegs, head, and heart, were laid out as offerings on the alabaster tables in front of the Benben monument. And then, as the papyri archives tell, there had followed a carefully structured and recorded distribution of diverse cuts of meat and offal, rank by rank, to the various households of the royal court and other groups, such as the households of the funerary priests. Later texts describe meat-eating as an especial delight. It was, after all, both a rare, rich food and the product of a ritual performed under the aegis of the king. One famous text, indeed, describes the acts of killing, cooking and eating a bull by a king and various gods with such literary gusto that until quite recently those cosmic gourmets had been construed as cannibals. Ever since the days of the first pharaohs, and probably in earlier times as well, quantities of cattle and meat products had been shipped to the settlements of the first pharaonic courts, which had assembled on the narrow sill plains of Memphis where there was insufficient land for their support. Great herds had been kept on scrub land along the Nile's Valley, some of which were sent downstream to the river's delta during the dry season for fattening on its plains and marshlands. Those same broad delta wetlands had also supported large and well-established colonial estates that since the times of the archaic kings had specialized in meat production, and, as recent archaeology and the Palermo stone both inform us, the kings of Abusir had also held estates, like the settlements of Mahdi and Miranda, which in previous millennia had served as conduits between the communities of the rivers valley and its delta. Heliopolis with its shrine of Re was also situated at that juncture in the Nile's progress where the valley's limestone cliffs slowly begin to disappear and the silt plains of its delta start to fan out towards the Mediterranean. And it is this, the fact of its location along with the relationship of its Benben and its related sight lines, that underlines the links between the shrine of Re at Heliopolis and the sun temples at Abusir. for though considerable quantities of meat were shipped to the sun. Temples in the times of the Abusir kings, and their facilities for slaughtering were substantial. There is not a trace of the corrals that would have been required to hold the living herds of cattle on their rival from the great estates. Here, then, the enclosures at Heliopolis, which were far larger than those at the Sun Temples, may well have served as depots in the manner of similarly enormous mud brick enclosures that had been built in the times of the first kings. The same state systems of transportation and supply, indeed, had been in use in those archaic times, when boats had been buried beside some of those mud brick enclosures, a process echoed at one of the excavated Abusir Sun temples which had a mud brick replica of a boat beside it. Continuing this same underlying theme, near contemporary royal texts, naming Heliopolis as the site where the gods reside commonly describe them as bulls from the grasslands or cows who, in the forms of queenly goddesses, suckle and nourish the king, whilst a common royal epithet describes the king himself as a great bull. In such a vivid landscape, the sight lines between Heliopolis in the east and the Sun Temples in the west, the continuous traffic on the Silver River, the bloody rituals in those temples, all map to power and majesty, the daily drama of the journey of the pharaoh and the sun from sunrise at the Benben to sunset. At the line of pyramids, the value and the worth of things, as the surviving texts from tombs and temples had long suggested, and the detail of the Abusir Papyri has further underlined, the state's resources were controlled in Pharaoh's name. Its warden oversaw the construction of the pyramids. It authorized the provisioning of the royal palaces and the workshops of the state. It administered estates both in the Nile's delta and its valley. It maintained the state's considerable transportation network, and it controlled the manufacture, processing, and storage of its provisions and supplies. Yet the living kings, the archaeological record suggests, had lived in modest mud brick settlements, whilst the officials of the state appear to have operated a simple system of direct and personal control. A modern mind might sense a contradiction. Had not the offices of this ancient kingdom cut and moved millions of tons of stone with an unmatched speed and built pyramids of phenomenal accuracy? Had not its workshops produced considerable quantities of beauteous objects for centuries? And is not all of that, in turn, speak of elaborate governmental structures? Essentially, there were two groups of people in Old Kingdom Egypt. The first consisted of the farmers and the workers and allied trades who, between them, comprised the bulk of the population of the Lower Nile, which at that time, so best estimates suggest, was close to 1 million people. The second group comprised those people who were not directly employed in food production, the households of the officers of state, those of the priests and scribes and palace servants, the masons, sculptors, jewelers and storekeepers, the boat captains, the master builders and the staff of offices throughout the kingdom that oversaw the transportation of supplies to the royal household and all its various activities. In the days of the Giza kings, this courtly community, the combined households that contain the living reality of ancient Egyptian courtly culture, may have held as little as 10,000 adults. Though when labor-intensive activities such as mining and quarrying, and the construction of pyramids and temples were underway, they could pull farm workers and the other tradespeople into that rare orbit, as required. In the times of the Abusir kings, although the numbers of tomb chapels and named court officials was certainly enlarging, the kernel of that enterprise still seems to have been controlled by a small body of men, perhaps 150 in number. In all probability, those people were known directly to the king, as well as administering the regions of the Lower Nile in Pharaoh's name. They may also have managed agricultural estates. Ultimately, as the paintings and reliefs in the temples and tomb chapels tacitly acknowledge, everything depended on the labor of the farmers. Before the modern age, when human societies were more delicately balanced between prosperity and oblivion, few rulers or Courtiers had been foolish enough to kill the farmers or even to remove them from the land. For farmers, as one text observes, made everything. By definition, subsistence farmers do not produce large surpluses, so if the offices of the pyramid-building courts had simply tithed communities of subsistence farmers, they could hardly have collected supplies sufficient to their needs. Traditionally, Egyptologists have assumed that the ancient situation had been similar to the cruel regimes of 19th century Egypt, and much is made of tomb chapel images of wily peasants being beaten so that they will give up part of their harvest. More balanced analyses, however, suggest that the real secret of the phenomenal prosperity of Pharaoh's court is that from its beginnings it had provided the farmers of the Lower Nile with sufficient resources. Everything from standardized agricultural equipment to the organization of the labor systems that cut and maintain canals and irrigation basins, to enable the production of far larger amounts of food than the farmers and their households could ever have required. The Old Kingdom court also continued the colonization of unused floodplains in the regions of the Lower Nile, a policy which appears to have begun in the time of the first pharaohs, when many newly established settlements and royal estates had supplied the offering tables of the tomb chapels in the courtly settlements of early Memphis. This was part of a millennial process, from its beginnings to its end. The history of pharaonic agriculture is one of internal colonization, of further exploitation and enlargement of the cultivatable regions of the Lower Nile under the aegis of the king and court. And right from its beginning, that process had been so successful, the produce of the world's most fertile floodplain so superabundant, that in the first centuries after the state's establishment the archaic kings were being buried in massive tombs filled with vast amounts of courtly objects, the products of the court's considerable workshops. And this continuing pattern of ever-growing farming surpluses had enabled the construction of the colossal pyramids of Sneferu, Khufu and Khafra and, in later centuries, the monuments of Abusir and Saqqara. In the first years of their construction, when their bases were wide and access to them had been easy, the great royal pyramids would have required workforces of 40,000 or 50,000 people. Those pyramids alone, therefore, are unequivocal evidence of the remarkable success of the state's farming system, and grain had been the basis of that enterprise. As the archaeology of Old Kingdom courtly settlements and the abundant images of grain stores in the tomb chapels both serve to underscore, even though the focus of the state had changed after the age of the Giza kings and considerable herds of cattle were being slaughtered on the altars of Abusir, grain rather than the relatively profligate activity of rearing cattle had yet remained the linchpin of the state economy. Whilst the pharaonic court held sufficient supplies of grain and manpower to maintain its various offices and build stone monuments, that situation did not change until the coming of the Greeks, when active irrigation systems and new strains of wheat were imported into Egypt. Until that time, everything had depended on the government's efficiency and the size and regularity of the river's annual inundation. There was no economic progress in a modern sense, no storm blowing from paradise that is so essential to the economies of the modern world. And that fact alone opens a yawning gap between present-day experience and that of the pharaonic kingdom, most immediately in the use of the word economy, whose modern meaning is less than a century old. For it is not a term that the pharaonic government would have understood, nor do any ancient texts encompass similar abstractions. Best then to employ a different vocabulary for modern descriptions of the order of this ancient state, one that blurs distinctions between sacred and profane, between rites of offering and the order and supply of the agencies of state, one that describes, for example, the pharaonic government's extraction of its resources from the lands of the Lower Nile as tithing rather than the more usual taxing. For the old-fashioned English term tithing has the advantage of isolating the ancient processes of supply from imaginary parallels with today, and the use of the term taxes which are monies paid towards the upkeep of Government simply monetizes Pharaoh. And money, which is an abstract measure of labor, goods and services, was not employed within the valley of the Nile until the final phases of ancient Egypt's history, when Hellenism was sweeping through the cultures of the ancient East. Just as it is difficult today to imagine how the order of a successful state, its history, its theologies, its legal codes were not laid down in written words, so it is equally difficult to imagine how such an opulent court could have operated without a form of money, without an abstract and precise measure by which everything, land and property, values, commodity prices, salaries, slaves and servants, could have been evaluated and controlled. So traditional historians imagine that such societies had invented full monetary systems of their own, hence the common assumption that the pharaonic economy was based on measures of grain or on gold or on copper rings of standard sizes. Such assumptions lead to a variety of confusions. The notion of ancient Egyptian slavery, for example, a pure product of monetizing Pharaoh, assumes the existence of modern concepts of personal ownership, of individual freedom and abstract independent wealth. Those ideas arrived in the territories of the Lower Nile with the introduction of stamped metal coinage in the first millennium BC. In pharaonic Egypt, as in the rest of the Eastern Mediterranean, the advent of Hellenism changed human perception within the ancient Middle Eastern world. So the philosopher Heraclitus, who had flourished at the time when money had first entered circulation, conceived his pre-atomic theory of matter as consisting of units of abstract energy that, like money, were interchangeable like goods for gold and gold for goods. Goods that Aristotle would later define as things whose value is measured in money. Just as a character in one of the plays of Aristophanes declares that he is longing for his village, which never said, buy charcoal, buy wine, buy oil. For my village did not know the word buy but produced everything itself, with no buying. So, too, there are no separate words in ancient Egyptian for buying and selling. Nor were their goods in Aristotle's abstract sense, just cows and bricks, boats and thrones, people both alive and dead, grain, pyramids and offering tables, Pharaoh and the gods. This is but one of the reasons why it is so difficult today to enter the world laid out in the fragments of relief from the temples of Abusir and, indeed, most other products of that ancient court. Just as there was no art in Winckelmann's definition of the term within that world, so neither were there any of Aristotle's goods. Notice, for example, that despite the seemingly endless repetitions of pose and subject matter in most ancient reliefs, there is a sensuousness in virtually every image. The ancient craftsmen show us neither goods nor crowds, but the individuality of every element in his universe. From a plant to a cow, a king or god, the great majority of the craftsmen's images, including hieroglyphic signs, which are mostly based on the forms of living things, carefully delineate the various qualities of life within the things that are portrayed. Yet modern awareness of the originality of those things is easily blunted by our largely mass-produced environment, so that when we look at the surviving fragments of those things we easily imagine that they are but curious works of art. Those same qualities of individual life are found in the omnipresent images of offering bearers who carry pots and baskets along the long walls of the royal temples and the nobles' tomb chapels. In their seemingly endless duplication, these scenes appear to be going nowhere. And to a modern eye there is a curious contradiction between their repetitive forms and the endless variety in the representation of their various elements: a peasant, another peasant, three nobles, a herd of cows, two boats, a king, a god, a plant. And all of them are different. In the same way, the obsessive detail of the inventories on the Abusir Papyri describes individual things rather than merely providing an account of a temple's assets. Just as the information recorded on the Palermo stone that the pharaoh Sneferu took more captives from the Southlands in that region with its meager lands could ever have supported, so too the list of the Abusir Papyri do not itemize components of an abstract national economy. The cloth and beer, the bread, bricks and onions and all the good things of daily offering that they carefully record, document the fulfillment of the state's obligation to provide life to the offices of Pharaoh and the gods, and to the households of the court both alive and dead, in the prescribed and proper manner. This is what concerned the scribes and craftsmen as they carefully and fondly drew and sculpted those familiar images, scenes and offering lists within the tomb chapels and temples, as they loaded almost every one of their images with a flashing eye, a pulsing limb, as they recorded the exact qualities of a catfish's skin or a butterfly's wing, as they carefully distinguished the different species of birds and fish within the lower